Thanks for tuning in. My name is Liz, and this is Neon and Chris with me. And today we're going to be talking about age-related myths in DIY, drawing on our own experiences within all ages and DIY spaces over the past decade. So to start, I'll just read from our description of our roundtable. How do all ages art spaces and do-it-yourself culture at large promote or challenge age-related myths in a music and entertainment industry that both propagates and consumes youth culture? Given all or nothing approaches to participation, such as, quote, DIY or die or all ages always within these spaces, how do their contravening narratives, one emphasizing longevity and commitment and another emphasizing novelty and fresh voices, drive a culture of dynamic collectivity simultaneously rooted in precarity and overextension? In negotiating these questions, this hour-long roundtable envisions a conversation centering the ways people age into, out of, and possibly back into underground and informal arts communities. I think we might adjust that hour-long vision that we had when we proposed this last year.
Cool. Thanks for reading that out. My name is Chris. So I guess the gist of this roundtable, or like the seed of it, is that we all know each other through DIY, through our participation in all ages spaces. So in lieu of something like a formal introduction, the way that we wanted to start was to have an informal conversation about both who we are, where we're at, but also how we know each other through DIY, our individual relationships to DIY, how they intersect, and kind of our journey through being attached to this very weird culture, sometimes being disillusioned with it.
I'm Neon. I guess my personal connection to, I grew up in Brooklyn, and my personal introduction to DIY was going to shows at Market Hotel and the old Silent Barn as a teenager, high school and early college, definitely under 21. So the all ages nature of it was important. But I met both of you in the Boston DIY scene, where I believe we were all in some university institution in some capacity. And I think I met Chris at Lorem Ipsum, which was a bookstore / venue / zine library home / zine manufacturing, secret basement, etc. And Liz was doing shows at her house at Dream House. And then we all worked at Silent Barn together.
Yeah, I guess the common thread in bringing us together was this weird bookstore in Cambridge that doesn't exist anymore. It was, I think, 1299 Cambridge Street in Inman Square. And I had just finished grad school and I didn't know what I was doing. And I just worked there as a clerk, essentially. And it was owned by this kind of techie bookstore guy who was never there. And the consequence of that is we kind of got to do whatever we wanted. And Liz was booking shows there, and there were a lot of great folks who played there. I mean, the most memorable show was the Screaming Female show, I think, that maybe Liz, you would want to talk about.
Yeah, so I got involved in all ages show booking also as a teenager, but interestingly, Lorem Ipsum, the bookstore that you mentioned, was kind of my first experience booking shows in any sort of collective environment. And I think that was part of what, well, it was Lorem Ipsum. I met Chris at Lorem Ipsum in the fall of 2011, which in my mind, that experience of stumbling into the Lorem Ipsum community in whatever capacity I was involved there, mostly just through booking shows and hanging out there, was around the same time as Occupy Boston, where I feel I was kind of, learning a lot about horizontal organizing and, direct democracy situations and being really inspired by that. And thinking a lot about like how do you apply that ethos to show booking. I also at the time was like, super inspired by Occupy, but also by this book called In Every Town an All Ages Music Manifesto, which I remember I ordered a copy of like right around like the season after Occupy. So it must have been like the beginning of 2012 or something. Um, and that book was like all about how to like, be on good terms with your neighbors, like raise money, like how to like do things, how to make the all ages show booking ethos like more sustainable, and how to like make spaces that like last longer, that aren't sort of like they're there and then they're gone, like um, spaces that last for a year. Anyway, like reading that book, that was like when I first started, like, getting it in my mind, like there were places where people were trying to figure out a way to make all ages spaces sustainable without just being like, oh, we're going to open a bar, really wanting to like put a sustainable, lasting model around like a true collective all ages vision.
Yeah. Should we talk about silent buying?
Yeah.
Really into it. So I guess silent buying, the first one was in Ridgewood, Queens, and none of us were involved in that, I believe. I attended it as a teenager who was lured to noise shows, but my friends told me they were punk shows, not punk shows. But I think I actually ended up moving into because of another mutual friend of ours. I like got stuck in New York, and then I was like looking for housing, and he was like, "Well, if you don't care about privacy, like live in the new Silent Barn." So I started living there, and then got involved in booking shows there. And then Liz moved into there, then Chris moved into there, and that was like the whole point of that was like to be a legal DIY space. I was looking at notes that I'd been talking with one of the co-founders about like sustainable DIY versus like apocalyptic DIY, which was a really fun trip to revisit. But it was just kind of like to do DIY like without the sinister aspect of it. And I think some of the original investors were like, this always has to be an all ages space, I believe. I could be making that up, but I think one of the core tenets was that it was always supposed to be an all ages space. There's like a lot to be said about it. I think it had a really like Occupy influence, like administrative structure, etc. I don't know, something interesting to me upon moving there was like, I feel like in Boston, there was always this feeling that DIY was something you aged out of. But I feel like in Silent Barn, there were all these like people in their 30s, which is weird because now I think we're all in our 30s. But I was like, wow, like you can be in your 30s and still do art. Like, it was cool.
One of the things that about Silent Barn that I always felt was really powerful was that like we had, I think, what we would sometimes call like cross-generational collective members or whatever. Like there are people who had been involved for like, over 10 years, and like the newer folks who just turned up, like, there were some examples of situations in which like the youngest person in the space and the oldest person in the space, like, could teach each other a lot.
To me, like the all ages and DIY mentality is like part of just this really big project of creating alternative spaces like that, that like safeguard like young people, people of color, queer people away from a very violent and very like hierarchicalized society. Even now, I think back on like what was so like magical and compelling about collective organizing, and like, something we haven't even talked about yet is like free schools and free schooling. That was like a part of Lorem Ipsum, and something I was really passionate about doing there in terms of like doing workshops and having skill shares and trying to bring some of that to Silent Barn. When I taught this like very funny 12-week class on intersectionality with a book called Captive Genders that's being shared a lot right now. And then, yeah, I mean, there's also this thing that folks are talking about, like artwashing and gentrification, and Silent Barn was definitely a place where that was happening, and you could see it happening. I think when y'all were like working shifts there, you would literally see like the yuppies who moved in across the street coming in and being like, oh, this is so cool. And I think like people are increasingly more vigilant about the way that artists are used as like the first like essentially colonizers of historically Black neighborhoods or historically low income neighborhoods, and real estate development utilizes that, you know, very nimbly. One of the major themes that I think we wanted to chart out for this roundtable was to think about like nostalgia as a way of like paving over the very real issues with all ages spaces, like how romanticization of these like temporary utopic spaces also contributes to like really harmful myths about DIY and all ages, contributes to like kind of uncritical reflection. So maybe, maybe we want to transition to that question and talk a little bit about you know, how these spaces get mythologized.
So just before we were on this call, like I was thinking about the mythology of all ages spaces and the way that like all ages spaces have been kind of like mythologized by the mainstream music press. And I kind of pulled up a few articles from like almost 10 years ago about some DIY spaces specifically in New York City, and like wrote down some words that like had been used in these like write-ups on these spaces. And the list included the words like chaotic, uncivilized, cavernous, pungent, repulsive toilets, stuff like that. And I feel like these are these things that are like meant to be associated with how like fun and free these spaces are. But like, I mean, one, like it's like at a certain point you have to acknowledge like it is unsafe to be existing within these spaces. And so like, you know, thinking about that, but then also thinking about like as you age, you know, even now at like age 31, like there are things I think back on 10 years ago and like my own involvement in DIY where I'm like, I couldn't handle that now. Like going on tour and like sleeping in someone's kitchen every night for like 2 weeks or 3 weeks in a row, or like, you know, sleeping in someone's weird like storage closet and getting all kinds of like weird bug bites or something. Like, you know, I can't do that now, but I just think about like, you know, all of the ways that the arts are like so like underfunded that like push people into these spaces to begin with. And it's like so many people who like are drawn to either illegal all ages spaces or non-functioning all ages spaces. Or if there is an option between like a funded non-commercial above ground space that was safe and legal and like the gross dank warehouse, like I think that, you know, a lot of people would choose the former. I don't know, can't speak for everyone. Some people just like are inspired by like gross dark spaces, and that's cool too.
Well, that makes me think of like these two things that I've been thinking of a lot recently for whatever reason, which is like, one is like, if we structure it this way, like it sounds like DIY is growing up. Like it starts as this like dirty, like monster child. And then it's like, okay, let's talk about process. But I think part of that is like a cultural shift too, because I remember when I was like a kid in DIY, like a lot of the spaces were run by like, you know, just like white dudes who were like, yeah, whatever, man. Like if you're not cool with this, like you're not cool. Like it's art, so we're gonna trash this house. And I think I start like, when I moved into Silent Barn, like I was one of the younger people there, but then like much younger people than us moved in. And honestly, like they were a lot of the like smarter and more careful people, even though like age-wise they were younger, but like often it was like the older people in the scene who were resistant to a lot of like sustainable and like more careful ideas. Careful, I don't know, like more humanizing ideas or something, because of this like old DIY myth, which I think now like people talk about it a lot with the Burger Records thing, where people like a lot of the founders of Burger Records and the bands have been called out for like sexual assault, which is something that is important to consider in DIY spaces. Is like who, like what is the all ages like ethos serving? Like, is it a case where a scene is run by a bunch of like guys in their late 20s, early 30s, and like there's a bunch of like young girls in their teens attending shows, and then like creepy things happen. Whereas like, is it like an actually youth-led space? So I think that's something to think about. And I remember like having conversations with some people when Silent Barn first opened, which is like sort of like people being like, I'd never want like a DIY space to be a vehicle for just like dudes in their 30s to like meet teenage girls. And I'm like, yeah, that's actually a terrible idea. And then the other thing that I was thinking about is kind of like what Liz was saying, which is that I think there's a romanticization of the real like dreadfulness of like disgusting DIY, which people posit as this like prerequisite for making good art, where actually it's just like a consequence of art not being valued in like capitalist society, where it's like spaces do have to rely on the bars to be open, like, and so like these kinds of spaces are pushed into the margin and don't have a lot of like recourses or resources and stuff, like where that's not, it doesn't have to be like that, but because it is like that, it becomes like associated with it. Like again, like revisiting talking to Lucas about sustainable DIY versus apocalyptic DIY, I remember this horrifying story where at the old Silent Barn there was like a show where someone like built a man out of roadkill like in the middle of the floor, and he was like, this is my house where I live and you have built like a man out of roadkill on the floor. It's kind of a thing where it's like artists have to be depressed, it's like have to be depressed and like living in squalor, and it's like that's just the condition of this, like that doesn't have to be romanticized. Like I don't want a man made out of roadkill on my floor.
Yeah, and it's weird too because the romanticization of living in squalor gets associated with the youthful mythology of DIY. But two counter arguments are that there are a lot of young people who surely do not wish to be operating within spaces like that, who would much prefer a space that was more accessible and safer and healthier, but it's not, they don't have access to them. And also there are a lot of artists that are not in their youth anymore that continue to live in squalor because of how the arts are devalued, and because so many people who like are lifer artists like don't ever get to the point where they have access to nice fancy spaces or whatever.
Yeah, and like the level of precarity that you are capable of accepting at any given moment. Like you said, where I feel like when I was younger, I was like, I never need to sleep. Like, this is fine. Like, I don't need to eat. And now I'm like, I need health insurance. Like, so it's like young, like in a way, I feel like these spaces are considered a young person's game, because when you're older, you like need to sleep and you can't be at a show that starts at 1 a.m, even though it said it was going to start at like 10 or what, like, I don't know. And it's because of this precarization.
Yeah, I mean, I also think it's deeply racialized. It's like the New York Times, especially, but a lot of major publications have the same story over and over again, which is like young white people living in these like neighborhoods. Who would have thought? Or like in these tiny spaces, and of course, it's like glamorized and sexy for young thin white people, and then for folks who like are living in similar conditions, it's like depraved or like sad or tragic. And it's another product of like the mythologization, but also these sort of like unchecked biases around DIY and all ages, like historicization, that, there's this sort of like line, this unspoken line that's drawn between very similar kinds of DIY projects. And I'm thinking in particular right now of like how, in my mind, like DIY is having another moment because everyone's assembling mutual aid, like in the absence of the state. So like bail funds and like book clubs, like all of this counts as DIY, and all of it counts as like inherently all ages because like it's accessible. And it's not like a depraved and lawless space, but it is like self-determined actions without like institutionalization, which is like fundamentally DIY. And all that said, I also think there's like a romanticization of mutual aid happening that a lot of folks are like grappling with, which is like, oh, it's so fun and sexy to like volunteer and drop off groceries to people. And it's like, no, all of that's like deeply sad and deeply like fucked. And we're doing it because of the failure of the state, not because it's cool and fun. So, a lot of the things that have happened in DIY, all ages, all of that are happening now. And even more kind of elevated ways. And it's profound and it's scary and vulnerable and all that.
That is super resonant. Like, I don't know, that gave me chills or something, because like I think there is such a parallel there where it's like precarity like sets up this material situation, and so these kind of like ad hoc structures emerge in response to it, and then there is like a romanticization and a codification of them. But really it's like there are structural like issues. I don't know. I don't have any answers to this, but I'm like,
Yeah, and I just feel like thinking about those issues like in conversation with like what sustainable all ages spaces could look like if they were funded, or if there were any sort of support for the arts in this country at all, is like, it's like sad to think about, because there's so many things that aren't possible because the arts are so devalued. Obviously, like I think when you look at like a hierarchy of needs, like it is not always, and rightfully is not always on the top of the list, because there are so many other things that people need, like food and shelter and
poetry is not a luxury.
like that's true. I don't know.
Maybe bedroom pop is a luxury.
Maybe it is.
Yeah, I remember after the Silent Barn shut down and a lot of other spaces shut down, like a bunch of like friends and I were talking, and we were just like, okay, but like where are the other spaces? Like maybe we just don't know about them because we're old, and like the kids are doing stuff that we're not cool enough to know about anymore. And then I feel like I asked like younger friends, and they're like, yeah, no, like there's not those spaces. I think mostly because of, I don't know, real estate. Like there's maybe it's just like that lull or something. And I've heard that that's true in LA too, and like in a lot of cities. But it is cool that a lot of the like racial justice movements are youth led. And I know that like I've heard that in a bunch of cities. And I remember seeing like Angela Davis like talk and say that like she's learning a lot about like we all stand to learn from like youth organizers and stuff. And if the kids aren't like building punk spaces, but if they're like leading protest marches, like that's pretty cool. I'm fully here for that. Yeah.
Yeah, maybe it proves, I mean, can't say for sure, but like I feel like I would not be surprised if the current generation of young people had a more sophisticated ability to connect between the places where they hang out and their political ideologies, or a more sophisticated understanding of how to connect those dots than like, people who were at DIY shows 10, 20 years ago. Like that would make sense to me. Yeah, but it's interesting thinking about in the youth-led nature of ongoing protest movements, the reality that now we all kind of exist in DIY, as Chris said, and those two dynamics, and thinking about like how do we foster like an all ages ethos that is more inclusive of truly all ages. And the looming question to me still is like, how can spaces like be better at being more inclusive of like be spaces that like offer platforms and opportunities of leadership and participation for young people, while also not like pushing people out once like their bodies literally can't handle like the types of spaces, and also the burnout. Like we also didn't even really touch on like the labor that goes into like organizing all ages spaces, and how time consuming it is, and how like there just necessarily is this like understanding that like if you're in it, you're in it, and it's your whole life. Like the gig is your whole life, you're there every night, which can be a life-changing experience. But it's also like, not everyone can turn up at the gig every single night. And I feel like this, like, I don't know, the kind of like expectation that like someone would need to be able to be at the gig every single night in order to be like a valuable contributor to a community space is like, has so many problems. I think something that was said over and over again is like people would be like, how do you get involved in Silent Barn? And you'd be like, just show up, like kind of thing. And like, some people need to know like, well, I need childcare, or like I need to take off from work, or like I need to plan for this. I can't just like be at the show every night. And I feel like that is like a real concern for how you make spaces like more accessible to people with different levels of responsibility in their life, who are probably older, but also there could be young people with lots of responsibility in their lives too, like young people who are, you know, taking care of their families, or like have after school jobs. And, you know, there's like all different types of barriers that could prevent someone from being able to like throw themselves into a project. They're not always age related.
Mm-hmm.
Which is I think why DIY spaces have skewed like affluent and like people who are like financially secure and like white, because a lot of people are like or like, you know, able-bodied is like another huge thing with a lot of these, like there's no concern for disability, or like because of the structure of these spaces a lot of time. And it's like, yeah, a lot of people can't.
So much of this conversation has been about the mythology of DIY as this like falling apart space that is like impossible on the body, and is this thing that people burn out on because it's like so much unpaid work, and also because the spaces are so untenable. And like connecting that to like a bigger political framework, I think is like, well, as we mentioned, almost intentional, because that is what keeps the spaces accessible, by them being so much about like putting your politics into practice instead of like over intellectualizing them. But I do feel like this conversation is an interesting moment where like we can connect to that bigger like political framework that DIY exists within, and how that political framework like in a lot of ways is responsible for like what keeps these spaces inaccessible to a lot of people for a lot of different reasons. And I think age is just like one of those um, intersecting inaccessibilities of DIY and all ages spaces often.
It's interesting that this is where the conversation has circled to, because all of what we've talked about like also maps onto particular moments in like the economic and like cultural history of the, you know, whatever the states in the last 10-20 years or so. And the moment that we're in now, like there is a highlighting of the precarity, like where we're all DIY all the time. It's like, I think this moment specifically really drives home the fact that like romanticizing things that have been like there's fun in it, right? Like I think there is something, like it was fun, we had fun, people are still having fun, there is fun to be had in these spaces. But like, I don't know, I think if we were getting paid to do the work that we were doing in these spaces, we would have been able to stay in them longer if this work like generated health insurance, like, or childcare, etc. Like the the use question would be slightly different, and or like the aging out of it would be different, the burnout question would be different, and the kind of youth that can get involved also would be different, like maybe not pay so much, but like other structures of care. So I don't know, it's like a tension, and I'm curious to see what happens going forward, mostly because of this point. I'm just curious to see what happens in the world going forward. But I think fetishizing youth has a lot to do with fetishizing like endurance and precarity and like idealization of something.
Yeah, I think the only thing I'd add is like the like the myth of accessibility does not mean like the death of expertise.
Yeah.
Like I think there were so many situations at Silent Barn in which we were like, we really need outside help. Like this is way beyond our depth.
I need an adult.
We need or you know, we just need someone who like this is their thing. You know, like there's areas where like you want someone who quote unquote knows what they're doing, and I think that's true of like all ages movements, youth-led movements as well. Is like for folks who are not youth anymore, it's very easy to say like, oh, you know, what the youth need is like they just need to like say what they want, and they're the leaders, and they don't, you know, they don't want to hear from us. And it's like, well, actually, you know, I think like young folks do want to hear from Angela Davis, and they would love to be in a room with her. And there are many times when I was a youth, I was like, I don't need to talk at all. I just want to like listen and like be in community with like folks who have a lot of history and knowledge. And like, I feel like that kind of component is happening right now. Like there's a lot of that kind of like intergenerational stuff working, and there's a lot of folks who like used to be like quote unquote youth activists who are like, I'm 60 now and here's like what I think, which is also cool because like everyone was young once. Yeah, you know, I think that's part of the conversation about accessibility is it doesn't mean that you enter a room and everyone gets to say whatever they want. In fact, there's actually a lot more attention on process now, and process is not fun, but it's work that needs to be done, especially, you know, in this moment of like mutual aid, meaning like supply distribution, or mutual aid, meaning like managing funds, like money, you know, and anytime money's involved, that like immediately becomes like super dense and difficult.
No, that's super important. Like elders in movements are super important. And for many reasons, all the ones you listed, and also just like so you're not reinventing the wheel over and over again.
But in music too, and in like music spaces, I feel like there's so much need for like lifers to provide examples to young people of ways in which you can remain involved in these spaces or involved in the arts or in music.
Yeah, and it's definitely incumbent on older folks not to just speak from a position of authority, but you know, to share that knowledge like in a way that's generous.
Yeah.
Because I do think there's, especially, I mean, I don't know why, but especially in punk scenes where it's like, well, you know, back in the day, like
when somebody proposes something and you're like, we tried that 7 years ago and it didn't work then, it's like the weight of burnout, like just making you so bitter.
Yeah.
Like, maybe I should like step out of this.
Like, okay, like, yeah, you don't want people making the same mistakes over and over again, but also like, um, you know, have to be open to the fact that like someone trying it again now, like will work it out in a way that you didn't.
That seems like a good place to end, right?
Put it out to the audience about like, you know, like what are other people's examples in all age or like experiences in all ages spaces. Because again, like we are coming from a really narrow set of ones. Like there's all ages spaces like in the Midwest and like the South and the, you know, places that aren't the States and the like, and we have some awareness of those through the touring networks that pass through these spaces, which I think have been super important, and like through the internet. But I don't know, I'm curious about other people's experiences and like how.
Yeah, like what models of all ages are you seeing? Do you even see this term circulating anymore? I see like youth-led a lot more, or like youth-centric, or youth movement.
I guess that's a good question too, is like, is all ages specific enough?
Yeah, what does all ages mean to people?
Yeah. If I could pose a question to the listeners and discussion group, I think it would be like, has anyone seen any other examples over the years or historically of spaces that did a good job being intergenerational?
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.
Thanks, PopCon. Thanks, people tuning in.